Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Shall we get started? So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Malice. I am the Chief Product Officer here at National Test Systems, and I'm also the co-founder of National Test Systems. I've been at this a little over 20 years now, 22 something perhaps. And ever since my brother and I started the company, he was always good at the business stuff. He could take care of inventory management and billing and invoicing and all this other business-related stuff that I was just never really good at. The one thing that I was really good at, because I was very interested in it, was learning all I could about the way that the drug tests work, all about the drugs themselves, all about the way the tests work, the way the drugs interact in the human body, really everything clinical toxicology, but especially as it relates to what we're doing, drug testing. So that luckily has been my focus for the past 20 some odd years. I like to think I've got a good bit of knowledge under my belt over that time. So we've got about a 20-minute or so webinar today, and after which we will do question and answer section. If you look on the left pane, you'll see a button labeled questions. If you would type your questions in there, I'm going to hold off till I finish the presentation before I get to the questions, but you can go ahead and type it in at any time. If for some reason we're unable to get to all the questions today, just know that your consultant will be reaching out in the next couple of days. And at that point, they will give you, obviously they'll answer your question, but they'll also give you an opportunity if you want to make suggestions for other subjects for other webinars, or if you want one-on-one training, whether it's this subject or a completely different subject, something that you, something that would suit you and your staff, or something important to you and your staff. Listen, we provide these webinars because we think knowledge is hugely important. We don't charge for these webinars. We want participation. We want to share our knowledge. And listen, we've got a decent turnout today for a not very exciting subject. So it just shows me that I'm not alone in wanting to expand my knowledge. And I'm glad to see that there are other people who agree, or at least willing to give me 15 or 20 minutes today to see if it's something that they really do want to enjoy. I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit for you. So as a company, as I said, education is hugely important to us, but let me just show you how. So we as a company have a set of principles that we conduct our business by. And every Monday, for example, our CEO will send us an email kind of recapping the week, talking about what to expect the coming week, and reminding us of one of these principles every week, just to keep us focused and remember why we're doing this. And I thought Mondays was especially a great time to give you an idea of some of our principles. One of them, for example, is honor commitments. One of them is do the right thing always. So these are things just reminding us how we should be conducting ourselves in our daily business. But the one this week was just perfect for today's webinar, so I wanted to share it. Today's was never stop learning. But the best part about it was the quote he included afterwards, which was NTS are passionate believers in the power of knowledge. And I just think that's so perfect for who we are as a company. And we're all about the knowledge. Anyone can sell you a drug testing cup, but we're not selling, we're not selling linens. We're not selling, paper towels or other things that a lot of businesses of this nature use. This is a very specific product, and it does require a specific area of expertise that I think is very important. And we like to remind you sometimes that, we are a good source of that information, and we're here to assist because we want you to have all the knowledge that we have. The reason we do this, we think it's going to make your daily drug testing duties a little bit easier, or at the very least a little bit more insightful. So what are we talking about today? Today we're going to discuss benzodiazepines. You see the slide says benzodiazepines are depressants, blah, blah, blah. We'll get into that in a little more detail as we go on, obviously. But the first thing I wanted to touch off on is a very commonly prescribed medication. And as such, it is also a common drug of abuse. We've talked about this in other webinars. So much of drug addiction in this country, well, really in the world, begins in the family medicine cabinet. A lot of kids, know some of these drugs, either hearing them at school or what have you. And, mom's got some Xanax in her medicine cabinet, so because they are so commonly prescribed, and we're going to show you just how common that is when we get there. But just keep in mind, because of that, they are more plentiful, and a lot of times have a lot more easy access for people who may or may not necessarily should have access to them. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what they actually are. So in a general sense, this class of drugs, we just call them sedatives. It's just, again, it's a very general sense of what it is. It sedates you. Same thing with so many other substances we talk about, barbiturates and other things like that. It is something that calms you down. Really what this is broken down, meaning benzodiazepines, are broken down into is a couple of different sections of or different types of sedation, I should say. We have an anxiolytic aspect to it, and that's anti-anxiety. We've got an anticonvulsant, which again is, it's to stop convulsions. It's a hypnotic, and again, it's similar to sedation, but not quite sleepy part of it. It can be a muscle relaxant, and it can be an antidepressant. I mean, they are prescribed for such a wide variety of things. I know someone, for example, who gets Ativan, who takes it nightly to go to sleep. It's every night they take a pill to go to sleep. That's just what they're prescribed it for. I know somebody else who has a Xanax prescription that they probably had for 5 years because they're only supposed to take it for IBS. When they have a spike of their IBS, they're supposed to take a Xanax. So these benzodiazepines really have a wide variety of uses for specific ailments or conditions. It just is a very broad class of drugs for what it does. So as of now, there have been about 62 different benzodiazepines that have been synthesized or discovered or created, or however you want to call it. But basically 62 total have been synthesized, and only 24 of them currently have been approved by the FDA. In other words, 24 of them are prescribable by doctors for specific medical conditions, and the other, quick math, 38, the other 38, they were discovered, but they just didn't have enough of the effect we were looking for without a negative side effect. And when I say we, I mean we as people who might take these medications. So keep this in mind. When a chemist or a company that is trying to make medications searches out a medication, or they discover or synthesize a new form of a substance, they're going to try every different version of this substance they can to find out which ones work, which ones don't work, which are the most useful, which are the least useful. And these are all, if you look at these, I don't know if you're familiar with molecular structures, but if you look like the 24 benzos, for example, they look almost identical. It's like one little piece that moves to different places. They're all very similar in chemical makeup. It just so happened that 24 of them were doing better than the other 38. So that's where we are. And that's going to come into play toward the end when we're going to bring up a separate or a nearby topic to this. So that's what we're looking at. Where they come from? So a brief history of benzodiazepines. So they were first synthesized, like I said, or discovered or created, whatever you want to call it. But they were synthesized in 1955, and that was Swiss chemists working at Hoffmann-La Roche. And the first one, which was synthesized, which was in 1955, I'm not going to try and pronounce the chemical name, but it's Librium, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. It's just been a word that's come up in our pop culture probably since 1955. And as you can see from the graphic here, we have a couple of old advertisements from medical journals where when they first discovered this new sedative and they started marketing it, mainly to doctors, obviously. It was never available without a prescription. But we start seeing them truly marketing Librium in 1960. In 1963, they first discovered or synthesized or released to marketing Valium, which is diazepam, and then that was made available. So that was in 1963. Now, up until this time, most sedation medication that was given for home use was barbiturates, which is things like, you probably wouldn't have heard any of them because there's so few of them left around anymore, but butalbital, things like that. Again, we don't hear about these much anymore just because since the mid-1970s, benzos completely have overtaken barbiturates as a form of sedation, again, for medications at home and even in hospital usage. The reason this typically happens is because of the lesser side effects involved in benzos than there were in barbiturates. Mainly, there was less respiratory depression going on using benzos for sedation instead of barbiturates. So it was a little bit safer. And again, this is 1970s thinking, so it wasn't perfect, but that kind of takes us to where we are now. There is also a lot of pop culture that you might have heard about benzos, but back in the 70s and possibly late 60s, Rolling Stones song "Mother's Little Helper." It's a song about people taking Valium, running for the shelter, or the little yellow pill. That's a Valium, basically. So all these things combined definitely saw that we replaced barbiturates pretty much entirely with benzodiazepines at this point. I think the only benzodiazepine I see these days is a migraine medication called Furoscient that some people I think are still prescribed. Not very common, however. So, again, I mentioned that it was a drug of abuse, but it is also very important medication. And again, it's been around since the 1970s and kind of growing in popularity, and that's really no accident. It's a very useful substance. So before we get to this list here, the first thing that's important to know is it is 2 of these benzos are on a list of the World Health Organization's list of essential medications. So basically the World Health Organization, WHO, compiles a list of medications that they feel are crucial. Usually when they're talking about these crucial medications, I mean, it's a general guideline, sure, but it's more guidelines for, let's say, Red Cross is going to an earthquake in Haiti. We know there's going to be loss of life, there's going to be injury. WHO says these are the medications that you really should always have with you when you go, out on the field like this and try and help people. On that list, we see 2 benzos, which are midazolam and diazepam. So again, they're useful medications just because they're abusable and addictive, and we'll get to that also. But just because they're abusable does not mean they are any less beneficial and helpful. So that WHO list includes anything from Band-Aids probably all the way up to novel antibiotics and surgical tools, things like that. It's a very comprehensive list of these things. And then the other part of this slide isn't necessarily about the importance, but just the commonality of benzodiazepines. So what we have here is a snippet of the list of the top 300 prescribed drugs in the United States. This list is from 2020, which is the last complete year that we have data for. So we have on this list, for example, at number 37, again, out of the 300 most commonly prescribed medications in the US, number 37 is alprazolam, which you might know better as Xanax. So that's the 37th most prescribed medication in the country, with more than 3 million patients, 3.6 million people in the US are prescribed Xanax. That's only 1%. Doesn't sound like a huge number, but once we start adding up the others, we've got not a sizable chunk, but we've got a non-insignificant chunk of people who are prescribed benzos. Next on our list is clonazepam, which is brand name Klonopin. That's number 44 on the list, with 2.4 million patients being prescribed. We've got lorazepam, which is Ativan, and that one's also just about 2.5 million patients being prescribed. We have diazepam, which is Valium, coming in at number 128 with 1.1 million. And cut off our list, just because I ran out of space, is temazepam, which is Restoril, and that's number 223 on our list of the most prescribed medications in the US. So it's a pretty good chunk of that list dedicated to one class of drugs. So again, there's definitely a lot of folks out there who need this medication or prescribe this medication for good reason. I always just put out that warning, don't leave them in a very obvious spot. Because like I said, a lot of drug use begins in the family medicine cabinet. So we talked about the importance. Let's talk about the dangers of this medication or this class of drugs. So the first one, obviously, is it is incredibly addictive, incredibly habit forming. If you start taking this medication for any length of time, it's not going to be easy to stop taking it. In fact, I wouldn't recommend it without a doctor's help. It has a very dangerous withdrawal symptoms, and one of them could be fatality. Now, some of the other ones listed we see with almost every substance. I mean, some of these I get from quitting my coffee for a week. It's nausea, sure. Insomnia, sure. Depression, maybe a little bit. But things from the benzo withdrawal include things like grand mal seizures, things like delirium and detachment from reality. So no, it's not really like me missing coffee for a few days in a row. It's a very, very serious withdrawal. In fact, it is probably only second behind alcohol. And in fact, everything I can find points to the fact that these are the only 2 substances where withdrawal can be fatal if not done correctly and under medical care. So keep that in mind. Very dangerous. Don't ever want to just stop completely. The other problem, and we'll get into it a little bit in a second here, is counterfeit pills. We've heard all the horror stories about every single drug that they're finding on the street now is 99% fentanyl, whether that is just in hopes of trying to find an easy way to disguise it, to smuggle it better. I don't think people who sell drugs are trying to kill people by giving them the wrong medication. Some of it's just sloppiness because they don't use necessarily the best lab practices in trying to press pills. But yes, we do see a lot of counterfeit pills. I mean, not that it was ever safe to buy, Xanax on the street, but this is probably the most dangerous time ever to be someone who is trying to find drugs from an illicit source, because you really don't know what's in there. Excuse me. And then lastly, we have another big issue, which is designer benzos. And I'll get that in a second, but really what that boils down to, that's the 38 benzos that weren't FDA cleared for use. But I want to give you a better description of that and what that really means. So again, useful, absolutely. Dangerous, absolutely. It's the double-edged sword that we see from so many of these medications. I mean, fentanyl is killing more people than any drug probably in our history, yet it is an incredibly useful tool for hospitals to use for pain relief. So unfortunately, the things that often help us the most are also one of the things that can be the most dangerous if not used correctly. So, all right, enough preaching. So let's talk about designer benzodiazepines. First of all, I really don't like the term benzodiazepines. I don't like the term designer anything, because what happens is, number one, I get a call that says, hey, do you guys have tests for designer drugs? There's 10 million things that I would consider, if we're going to use this as designer benzos, there's 1,000 other drugs I would consider to be designer. So all benzos have been discovered. All benzos are completely synthesized in a laboratory. What makes these designer benzos? It's just an easy name that the DEA likes to use, I guess, to try and classify these things as only being illicit substances, as opposed to the prescribed medication version, which is also a illicit substance and very beneficial. So this chart we're looking at here, this is from the DEA's Emerging Threat Report. The DEA releases both quarterly and annually something called an Emerging Threat Report. It usually focuses on what we call novel drugs, in other words, drugs that don't have hundreds of years history. On this Emerging Threat Report, in fact, if you've been to one of my Trends webinars, typically do those annually. We usually talk about all these things on the ETR. In addition to designer benzos, they talk about synthetic cannabinoids, they talk about the bath salt class, they talk about fentanyl, all these things. But we're focusing today on benzos. So these are all benzodiazepines that have been identified through confiscations or other means by the DEA. This is year-end 2020, if I'm not mistaken. It takes them some time to compile these things. So there were 375 identifications of designer benzodiazepines, and they all look like benzo names. I mean, anything with PAM, PLAM, RAN, typically those were all in the benzo class. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but you can see these are all substances that are not prescription benzodiazepines. They are benzodiazepines. And then take it a step further, that these are not diverted from a legitimate pharmaceutical company making these. They are completely illicit substances, bathtub labs, that sort of thing. So you don't know really what you're getting. And the other danger with designer benzos is they're typically not going to be detected on a standard benzodiazepine panel. So let's focus a little bit more about testing and see what that's about. So good news, as always, we've got tests for benzodiazepines. There is obviously a urine test for benzodiazepine. There is also a saliva test or oral fluids test for benzodiazepines. The one negative on the benzodiazepine panel, the standard benzodiazepine panel, is it is not going to be a reliable test for clonazepam or Klonopin. When tests are developed, the goal is to try and catch as much of a drug class as possible. Again, there's 28 different benzos. It's impossible to make an immunoassay that's going to react equally to all 28 of these benzos. So typically what the science is behind is pick a common metabolite of all these substances. On the benzos, it's something called oxazepam. And most common benzos will metabolize into oxazepam. Unfortunately, clonazepam does not do that. So while you might get, every now and then, somebody who's taking Klonopin might get a positive result on their instant test, on a standard benzo, it's more often than not going to detect it. Just know for something like that, we do have a clonazepam specific test, but of course, then that one's no longer sensitive to all the other benzos that we're hoping to detect. So it's one of the ones that there was really no way to get. It was either all these 10 or this one, and we went with the 10. And then, like most urine tests, it can be used for testing the surfaces or powders. If you find, residue, or you find a pill and you want to know if it's a benzodiazepine pill, our tests can be used as surface tests. I have a whole video demonstration of that on our website if you want kind of see how to use these as surface testing or powder testing, however you want to call it. But it's good to know that if you do find something, you can kind of get an idea of what it is if that's the case. All right, it looks like we've got a couple of questions, so let me go ahead. Ignore the waving goodbye. We're not there yet. Got a couple of questions out here. Let's look at these. So the first question, Ron asks, does the benzo test detect Ambien? Unfortunately, no. Ambien is actually not a benzodiazepine, and Ambien is something completely separate called zolpidem. A lot of times people get in the mindset that if two drugs are doing the same thing, they're probably very similar. Besides Ambien, the other question I get a lot is Soma, which is Carasprotol. I always pronounce that one wrong. But Soma, again, is not a benzo, completely different substance. So that one would not detect either of those. Does the benzo panel pick up roofies? Yes, luckily Rufinol is a benzodiazepine. It's flunitrazepam, again with the PAM. They like to make these words sound alike at least. So yes, the benzo panel will pick up Rufinol, which is good. I don't hear many stories about roofies these days, which is, knock wood. Not that it's not out there, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's just, it's going to probably, everything is cyclical. If it's not around now, it'll be around again, the way things usually work. Why is a benzo like Librium used for alcohol withdrawal? Both classes of drug have potential fatal withdrawal. I don't know the actual withdrawal, the medical treatment part of the withdrawal, but I would imagine under a physician's care, gently balancing these two things in order to ease through withdrawal, as opposed to, just cold turkey, for example. I would have to ask a physician to be sure. I'm imagining they wouldn't do this unless there was a science behind it. But I have seen benzos like this in the past used for alcohol withdrawal. It is common. And again, if it's under medical care, I have a feeling that that would kind of answer our question. Fortunately, that is not my area of expertise, but I'm going to look into that. If I can find an answer, Keenan, I will definitely let you know. Tamara, are we able to get a copy of this presentation emailed to us? Yes. Luckily, all the questions that are here will show up in my report afterward. So Tamara, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. I can absolutely send you a copy of the slideshow. And then also, I forgot to mention this earlier, I apologize. This webinar is being recorded. So if there's staff that were hoping to make it today and they didn't, just know the recording is typically posted today or the next day. And then we can send a link out, no problem. Could you discuss the detection window for the most common benzos? So yeah, we're going to talk about urine first because I just saw saliva popped up. So I might have to re-answer this, but the window of detection for most benzos is about 5 to 7 days. If you are a chronic user of benzos, I have not read any, I don't want to call them reliable studies, but I've seen reliable commenters talk about up to 2 weeks from somebody who was a chronic benzodiazepine user. I always like to point this out. Excuse me. When we talk about window of detection for substances, you got to keep in mind, when we give you a range like, 1 to 3 days, it's going to depend a lot on how much was used, if there was multiple usages. So when I say 5 to 7 days on a benzo, doesn't mean someone eats a 0.25 Xanax and it's going to be detectable a week from now. It's got to be, it's all going to be relative to the amount taken over how much time and that sort of thing. But for the most part, benzos are 5 to 7, chronic use up to 14 or 15 days. Naomi, can we receive a certificate of attendance or something along those lines? I haven't devised anything like that yet for any of our webinars, but that's something we have been looking into. I will continue to look into it. And I'm sorry, I don't have an immediate answer for you, Naomi. Probably going to be not tomorrow or the next day either, but it is something we are working on, including hopefully at some point being able to offer CE credits as well. But unfortunately, as of now, that is not the case. Sarita says, you mentioned saliva tests are hard to adulterate. However, I can personally attempt to false the test results by eating, drinking something prior. So the key to using any oral fluids test is not to have something in your mouth for at least 10 to 15 minutes prior to the test. So that would pretty much negate somebody putting something in their mouth prior. Anything that is ingested really shouldn't have any effect on the saliva, because when you're collecting saliva, you're not collecting the saliva that's been sitting in the mouth. Your saliva generates pretty quickly, obviously. So when you're putting those nasty sponges, I don't know if everyone's done an instant oral fluids test, but the sponge is not fun to put in your mouth. So that causes your mouth to salivate, so you're producing new saliva. So anything in the mouth, again, shouldn't be there, and then 15 minutes should be enough to clear it out. Anything that was ingested should have no bearing on the saliva. Yeah, thank you, Lauren. That's what I figured. So yeah, I answered it as far as urine was concerned. And then Keenan asked, any influence on how often fentanyl being found in illicit sold benzos compared to other street drugs? I can't find any real numbers on that. Not scaremongering, because it really is true, but I can't go a day without seeing like 100 new stories about, fentanyl tainted everything. Usually it is heroin, obviously. And then pressed pills are probably a close second. But I'm sorry, I don't really have any hard numbers for you. And I don't know that I'm going to find any that I would really, feel like I would feel comfortable passing on, because it's probably going to be a lot of hearsay, as we see so much on reporting on anything these days. So I apologize, I don't have that. Don't know that I would be able to get you a number I would feel comfortable as fact. So, all right, looks like that's it for now. If anybody thinks of anything else after the fact, reach out to me. Reach out to your consultants if you're already talking to one. Thank you all so much for coming and spending half an hour with me. That's great. It really, again, I know I said it 100 times in the beginning, but it tickles me that people want to know more about the things that affect their job on a daily basis. I'd like to ask all the people who aren't here, why not? So that's just me, that's what I say. But anyway, again, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming. And until next time, keep on testing.